Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to take a technical look at the G80 M3. I have to take the wheels off for a couple reasons. I got to install these wheel locks. And I didn't buy this, but it came with my other car and I kept them self-centering wheel caps, so I figured I might as well install those. So I figured while I'm in there, I might as well make a technical video on this G80 M3, show you the suspension, the undercarriage, talk about the engine, etc. I made a similar video on my M340i when I got it. And as a matter of fact, I think one of the best ways to highlight the differences on the G80 M3 versus the regular 3 Series is to compare it to the top range regular 3 Series, the M Lite M340i. So we'll get underneath the car and take a look at the LSD, the exhaust. We'll take a look at the brakes and suspension, etc. And I'll contrast it to the M340i. I'll insert clips so you can see the difference. So these are the laser lights. And I had regular LEDs in my M340i, and you guys were asking about output and how they have changed or if they're any better. And to be honest with you, due to regulations in the US, they've been limited under normal low beam use, so they're not very different than the standard lights. What I noticed about these, which was pretty cool, is there's a cornering lamp. When you're turning, that will illuminate the side of the car. These headlights still swivel and follow the steering wheel input, but they also have that cornering lamp. Now, to really get the full effect of the headlights, you have to keep this button pressed when the headlights are on. It will be automatically set, but when you tap that, that's auto high beams. With the auto high beams initiated, they're pretty nuts at night. They're so bright that it would illuminate the signs to the point where they're borderline uncomfortable to stare at, just at that limit where it would be uncomfortable to the eye. So they're super bright when they're on bright mode, and I believe that's just to meet US regulations. A couple of you guys asked me for more interior shots of this car, so let me show you that. There you have the seat. These are the standard seats. It may not look like it, but the bolstering is still pretty aggressive on this. As you can see, it does stick up quite a bit. If you guys have seen the carbon seats, they look really awesome, but they have that little hump in the middle here. I didn't want that hump in the middle there, but I really contemplated getting them. I didn't highlight the interior because to me it didn't look that different than the regular M340i interior, just a little bit nicer. It has the gloss finish on this versus matte. The steering wheel looks just about the same, except for it's got this carbon fiber trim, the M stitching, and it's got this gap in the middle here. So I went for the ventilated seats in this car. It was a $350 option, but well worth it. If you were to tap this, it would just activate seat heating like usual, and then if you wanted to turn it off, same story, just go on and off, and it would almost confuse you as to how to work with it. Once you tap that button once, you can hit the cooling, and you can have both heating and cooling at the same time, or you can turn off the heating. Now you'll have blue LEDs lit up, and it'll remember and stay in cool mode for as long as you want until you switch it back to heat mode or both. And you can hear them activating. They're pretty effective on this car, surprisingly, compared to other models I've experienced. So I'm going to talk about a few things in this video, but one of the things I want to cover is that this car weighs less than the regular 3 Series. One of the ways they did that is by deleting the center armrest in the rear. Another way to accomplish that is via the carbon fiber roof and no sunroof mechanism. Another thing I noticed is here there's no auxiliary battery behind this grille as there is in the M340i, so there's a weight savings there. And another reason for weight savings, which I'll cover, is the rear suspension appears to have a lot more aluminum in it. So I gotta highlight the most controversial part of this car right now, but we're not gonna talk about the looks. I've grown to be accustomed to it, and of course I went with black. But there's no active shutters behind the grille at all for fuel savings. It's just open. In braking mode under regular mixed driving, I'm averaging about 4 miles per gallon less with this car. So the emphasis on this car, of course, is performance. Under this cover, there is no sound deadening material. This car has dual fuel pumps, which we're going to talk about, and the regular 3 Series just comes with one fuel pump. The ignition coils are the same. This car has dual air boxes, one on each side to meet the air demand. And on the M340i, it's just on this side. The M340i also in this area had a big resonator connected to the airbox to cut down on induction noise. Whereas here, that's not an issue. Induction noise is preferred if you're going to buy an M car typically. On the hood itself, there's no sound deadening or material. With regards to how this car is constructed, I don't really believe that there is any less sound deadening being used for weight savings, even though the car is a lot noisier on the road. And I would attribute that to the fact that the subframe is bolted directly to the chassis of the car, so you're hearing the road noise and suspension translating through it and the actual tire noise coming straight through. When you're just sitting at a light, it feels like the car is just as quiet as the M340i was if you have the engine turned off. Only when you're moving would you notice a difference. What you do get at the back end is a bit of diff whine. Just minor when you're cruising along or accelerating. It's super minor, but you can kind of hear the drive line doing its work. And once we get underneath the car, I'll show you this differential. It looks quite different than the M340i. It feels like it's more mechanical, not necessarily electrically assisted. So just pulling up my driveway and whatnot, you can kind of feel the car binding as it would as they're locked really tight and it wants to skip up the driveway as you're coming off the road. You know, it's a good feeling, but at the same time, you just feel like it locks super aggressive. Here's the intake manifold from an N54, pretty traditional looking. The manifold for this car is also very traditional looking. I'll insert a clip of the B58 intake manifold for comparison. That looks quite different because the heat exchanger is built into the manifold itself. On here you have a traditional looking intake manifold, but if you look below it, you'll just make it out here, but there's a big metal box right here. That is your air to water heat exchanger right here. So as the hot compressed air comes through here, it makes it to the bottom of this, gets pushed through, and then finally makes it to traditional looking intake manifold to feed the cylinder head. So the difference is this is embedded in the B58, this is below the manifold, probably for better air velocity. This is the first gen high pressure fuel pump for an N54 or early N55. It was overkill from the factory, but it was chain driven and they had their problems in the beginning. They eventually sorted it out. But the fact that this was such overkill because they were erring on the side of caution in terms of fuel delivery meant that the car got a cult following because you can easily add power without changing all the ancillary parts around your engine to supplement. You could make another couple hundred horsepower without touching this. Now, the same story holds true for these injectors. They just are not your limiting factor. They're piezoelectric versus solenoid based. They look like a diesel injector, if anything. They're super overkill. They were problematic in the beginning, but eventually all things were sorted out and you just had all the room you'd ever need in terms of fuel injectors to make big power. Again, one of the reasons why an N54 is considered legendary and has a cult following. Easy power for the money. Something that's very unique to the S58 compared to all other BMW turbo motors, including the S55, N54, N55, etc., is the compression ratio of the engine. On this N54, it's 10.2 to 1. What that means is as this piston gets pulled down into the bore, it'll go down far enough that by the time it brings up the compressed air, it's a ratio of 10.2 to 1. When this engine came out, the N54, they introduced direct injection technology. And this injector resembles a diesel because it's going right into the combustion chamber, right beside the spark plug, which is unique. Normally it used to get sprayed into the intake manifold. Excuse the mess, but if you look right here, this is where the injector sits. It comes right into the combustion chamber, right beside the spark plug for better atomization. You'll see the injector tip would live right there. Now, in older generation cars that didn't have direct injection, you would have had regular injection. The fuel rail would be bolted to the intake manifold. There'd be a hole right here. The injector would be poking in right here, and it would be spraying fuel along with the air coming in to go around the valves and into the combustion chamber, and you would lose efficiency and you wouldn't have a perfect atomization and you wouldn't have even burning in the combustion chamber, etc. So you have to use your imagination here, but this is where the cylinder head would be. If you didn't have direct injection, then you'd have the manifold sitting approximately here, and then you'd have the hole. Once the air-fuel mixture gets around the valves and everything, it would eventually find its way in to the combustion chamber. Let me save you using your imagination. Just look into that hole there. You'll see that if you didn't have direct injection, you have the air mixing with the fuel on the way in. It has to bounce off all those walls and get past those intake valves and eventually make it into one side of the combustion chamber. And you'll lose some fuel due to evaporation. You won't get as good atomization by the time it makes it into the cylinder head. And the only trade-off is your valves will stay clean with port injection. So if this was an N52 instead of an N54, you would have that scenario. The fuel would eventually make it in and then it'll get burned. But really, are you getting it right by the spark plug? Are you avoiding having it go off before it ever gets sparked by the spark plug? You never know. So if you're to run high compression with port injection, you're going to need a higher octane fuel to be able to avoid detonation, because you can't really control when it's going to go off. It may go off as it's just entering the combustion chamber, and it'll go off on one side of the piston, or maybe if there's enough heat in there, it'll kind of act like a diesel and go off before the fuel is ready to be burnt, because the spark plug hasn't even activated as of yet, and you can get knock and detonation. That's why you would normally go to a direct injection, to be able to burn more fuel. Now, I'm no expert here, but this is just how I understand it. If you're going to go to direct injection, meaning you're going to inject it right into the combustion chamber to avoid it going off sooner than it should be timed perfectly, then you're going to want higher compression to get your benefit out of doing that, because you're trying to avoid it going off. And the higher compression you can make without knock or detonation, the more power you can make. So typically what you'd see with all these BMW turbo engines is a compression ratio of 10.2 to 1. And for regular models that are meant to be more torque based and more civilian based, regular car based, then you'll have 11 to 1 compression, and you'll be able to benefit from getting more energy out of the fuel at the expense of potentially knocking. So you wouldn't want 11 to 1 compression on a tuner car, because you'd have to run ethanol to avoid knock, like the first Supra that they brought out. Now the 2021 Supra has a different compression ratio, but they really benefited from ethanol. And another thing to consider is, why would you want to run higher PSI? Why is it 5,000 PSI instead of 2,900 PSI on the newest generation S58 and B58? So that you can get better fuel economy. You have much more atomization, because by the time it comes out, it's pure vapor, and you can control the burn a little bit better. So on the B58 and the S58, they have split cooling. So they can actually control how much heat is kept in the block versus how much heat is in the cylinder head. You want the block hotter, but you don't want a hot block making the head hot, because then your intake air temperatures will go up and you'd have more issues. But if the block can be kept hot to burn by the time the fuel makes it into the chamber, but the head can be kept cooler to keep the intake air charge lower, there's a benefit there. Maybe power, but more so clean burn and more efficiency, because you're getting the most out of the highly atomized fuel pressure in the block. What I find almost puzzling by this engine is the fact that it's got a 9.3 to 1 compression ratio. You could get away with port injection conversion on this and not have issues, because it's running such low compression, to the point where why would you run low compression and direct injection and the split cooling on an engine that is going to not need it? You could have run higher compression, more timing, less PSI, but then you know what that makes for? A nervous car that's really twitchy and has way too much torque down low and traction issues. I can't think of another car that would be turbocharged direct injection but such a low compression ratio. They've tuned the compression ratio in such a way that the power band gets shifted up, and you can still run high boost, so it feels fast. And the way this car hooks off the line is pretty nuts. It doesn't feel right, actually. It just seems like it's almost an all-wheel drive. So I believe that they tune the compression ratio low for traction purposes, but that's why these run such high PSI, 25 PSI nearly on the competition. People are like confused by that. It's so high. If that was on an N54, it'd be making a lot of power, but what they decided to do was run more boost so that you get a higher power band, and also benefit from direct injection at high loads. You can burn the fuel and completely atomize all the fuel, so you'll clean burn under heavy loads, which is unique to this car. I don't think I've ever seen that before, where near redline, you're finally seeing the benefits of the direct injection system when the car is under heavy boost. As far as I ever have known it, direct injection cars were always about better fuel economy and better power. Back in the day, 2 liters were capped out at around 135 horsepower. Now it's 160 to 180 horsepower. Just because of direct injection, you're getting more out of your fuel before you knock. So high compression engines can compress more air for every cycle, and therefore you get more energy out of it, provided you can control knock. How do you control knock? By injecting it right beside the spark plug at the exact time you want under high pressure, to overcome the excess pressure of the combustion chamber as the piston's on its way up. You have to fight through that air pressure. So out of everything on this G80, the most interesting fact to me is the fact that this is a low compression direct injection engine that needs those turbos badly to even work properly. If you ever tried to run this low compression at NA, it would make maybe 230 horsepower or something like that. It's just not going to be ideal. It needs those turbochargers, and it needs high boost to clean burn at high RPMs. But what that does is leave so much meat on the bone in terms of potential for extra power. I saw a video by RK Tunes where he tuned one of these on an X3 M Competition, and he gained 130 wheel on just tuning. He didn't touch the downpipes or run ethanol yet, which is nuts. But it's just a byproduct of the fact that this is geared toward clean burning at high RPMs, in my opinion. What I picture happening in the future is people running 30 PSI on stock turbos and running ethanol. But really, if you just want to gain like 100 wheel, you can leave everything alone and just tune it. But of course, the ECUs are locked anyway. The pistons on the S58 are actually fully forged. There's debate over that, but it's clearly listed on all the technical documents that I found. They're fully forged. To have fully forged pistons means you should be able to make 800 wheel horsepower reliably on a stock bottom end, which is pretty nuts. For perspective, the HPFP on the B58 can even handle up to 600 wheel horsepower just with the one HPFP. On this car you have two, so when you add those together, you probably get to 800 wheel horsepower without even changing your fueling system, which is pretty crazy as well. So the way I look at it is anytime they chase emission standards and chase efficiency under normal use, you also get the byproduct of better power given the same volume of fuel, which is pretty awesome. And that's for that reason, people shouldn't be too upset that they keep innovating in terms of emissions to keep the internal combustion engine going. BMW is still sticking to the ICE engine for a while, which is good to hear. And you know, hybrid technology at the end of the day, when you supplement it, it's going to make the car perform better. One last point under the hood at the back here where the timing chain lives, they made it a lower friction timing chain setup, which is carried over only from the B58 TU and the G20 series. That's one of the few similarities that the S58 shares with the B58. Now I'm going to get the car jacked up and show you the suspension. Unfortunately, I couldn't find my jack pad adapter, otherwise I just would have used that. Installing the self-centering center caps. So let's start with the rotors are 14.6 inches versus 13.6 on the M340i. The caliper is similar. It's a floating caliper because of the e-brake design, but all reviews are saying that the brakes are excellent on this anyway. This is just by design, and most of the braking is done by the front end anyway, but it's still a large rotor. So another area where this car differs big time in terms of suspension compared to the standard 3 Series is all the thrust arms, the whole suspension back here, even the shock is aluminum. It's adjustable. The coil spring, everything just looks different back here. And that's another place where there's major weight savings in my opinion. So there's a look at the suspension, and I'll show you the M340i for comparison's sake. All aluminum everywhere. As you can see, everything's aluminum. The subframe and everything just doesn't resemble the regular car at all. If you look at that rear differential, that finned cover is huge now on them, and it seems very different than the locking differential on the M340i, which is electronically controlled. Quite interesting. Now, if you look at this exhaust, it would be a head scratcher. You'd ask yourself, well, okay, that looks cool, but what's the point of kicking it all the way over to the driver's side of the car just to have it come back to the center? What's the motivation? It's for equal length so that it doesn't sound like the S55, because a lot of people complained about the sound on the M3 of last, the S55. So even though this is probably less efficient, they addressed it by kicking the exhaust over to the one side so they're equal length to have the pulses balance each other out and overlap at a time that seems more smooth and natural sounding. Excuse the dirty car, but since both these cars are similar in their exhaust design, where they have twin turbo single scroll, I figured I'd do a cold start on both so you can hear the difference. And I think in a way the S58 kind of sounds more similar to this than the S55 did because of the way they designed the exhaust. Now we're going to start up the M3, and I'm going to leave the valves closed until the car warms up a little bit, then we'll give it some revs when the valves open. So that's much deeper, obviously, with the valves open and the exhaust hadn't warmed up yet, so the burbles didn't really kick in. But it kind of feels like it's building more of a burble with time, actually, I guess, during the break-in. But weirdly enough, I kind of hear a little bit of M340i B58 sound mixed with the N54 and S55 all combined. Because on cold start, you get that rasp that you get from an S55. When you rev it up a little bit with the valves open, it kind of sounds like the B58 a little bit deep. But also it's got that signature straight twin turbo sound that you'd only get when you have two separate turbos combining the exhaust gases through a true dual exhaust system. So overall, I like the way it sounds. I don't love it as much as I loved my B58 sound, but it's still good. Actually, I just realized that I also have a similar exhaust clip from when I was revving my B58 when I first got it, so I'll insert that so you guys can kind of hear all versions. But otherwise, that's going to be the shot of the undercarriage. You have the aluminum reinforcement plate. So one observation is the undercarriage is more open. You have less aero coverings for the sake of cooling. I guess if that exhaust were to get hot, there's going to be more emphasis on cooling, less on shielding the undercarriage for fuel economy. That brace looks pretty beefy. It's interesting. I didn't expect to find even the shock absorber is aluminum. But it just goes to show that if you were to drive this car and if you were blindfolded, you wouldn't realize that you're in anything related to a G20. It doesn't feel anything at all. Literally, not even 1% like the regular model in my opinion. But at the same time, I'm gonna get some flack because I said the M340i is an M light car. It is. It's kind of like taking a 335i and putting all the M suspension on it. I did that on my 335i. But just the way everything comes together and how it's all homogeneous on this car, makes it feel quite different. So in comparison, these brakes are pretty crazy. You got 6-piston fixed calipers, and compared to the M340i, it's just kind of night and day, even though those brakes were phenomenal. I believe the rotor is 14.9 inches on this. This front rotor should be 14.9 inches versus 13.7 on the M340i. What I just noticed is the wheel liner doesn't have carpeted inserts for sound deadening. So perhaps that's why when the car's moving, it's a little bit noisier as well to save a few pounds. You can see one of the heat exchangers there. Very aggressive design. Here's a look at the suspension. All aluminum. The end link looks a little more conventional compared to the M340i. A little stiffer. The shock body is aluminum. So the suspension seems relatively simple or similar to the older generation M cars. It's just designed for more initial turn-in and whatnot. But to be fair, the regular M340i had aluminum front control arms and everything as well. But this has just got the M geometry. If anything, this now resembles my E90 after putting M3 control arms. For perspective, this is my Samsung S21 Plus, which is like a massive phone, about as big as you could ever find, really. And it looks tiny. It's funny. One thing I wanted to touch on while I put this wheel back on is the fact that I'm surprised how well they tuned this car to run the lower compression and still feel torquey. They did a really good job. It's at the brink of hooking the way they calibrated things, so you're better off having less torque down low on these cars anyway, and they realize that, I believe. So nobody's complaining because now instead of just going sideways, you dead hook. Given these are M14 bolts, I'm going to torque them to 140 Newton meters. Alright guys, once I'm done the break-in, we'll go more in depth and I'll give you my driving impressions of this car. Right now I got about 500 miles and I got to get it up to 1200 miles. If this is the first video you're catching on mine, please consider subscribing and also consider giving it a like if you want to help me rank a little bit higher and help me grow my channel. Thanks for watching.